Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 115, Killing in Serial. It's not a series of episodes about killing, but...
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that each of our episodes constitutes a mini-series within itself in which we dissect three movies in a row.
Yeah, that's our shtick. But we're talking about serial killers. Those who have vendettas against frosted tigers and tropical toucans and that kind of serial killer?
No. We're going to be talking about the true crime style serial killer. Okay. The kind that podcast listeners everywhere, including probably a bunch of our listeners, are obsessed with. And in fact, we love them so much, we like making movies about them too. There's something about it that's just so endlessly fascinating. And we'll see if we can try to put a finger on what that might be today. And first, we're going to talk about The Night of the Hunter from 1955, which is the only movie ever directed by famous actor Charles Laughton. It stars Robert Mitchum, relatively young Shelley Winters, and then a relatively old Lillian Gish.
She was so great in that movie.
I didn't even realize that was Lillian Gish until I looked up who was in this movie, which is shocking. For those of you who don't know, I think she might have appeared on one or two of our polls for silent film.
She was actually in a bonus episode too with Broken Blossoms.
Yeah. She was a famous silent film actor who still worked throughout the sound era, just in much more bit roles as she aged, which is a very common pattern to see during classical Hollywood. And this is a movie based on a real killer known as Harry Powers, who was hanged in 1931, I believe, for the killing of a few widows and a few children as well, which is very accurate to what happens in the movie. I'm sure this is, of course, very dramatized, and I don't have all of the podcast and the court trial footage, because that wasn't a thing yet, from the time to detail who this Harry Powers guy really was. But just to let you know, this is essentially a true crime movie, just in a dramatized fashion. Then we're going to talk about The Silence of the Lambs from 1991, directed by one Jonathan Demme, I'm not sure, starring, of course, Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, based on the Thomas Harris novel from 1988 of the same name, which is the second in the trilogy, preceded by The Red Dragon and ending with Hannibal. This, of course, won a lot of Oscars, including for Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay. And it was still nominated for 2 more, Best Sound and Best Editing. I don't know who won Best Sound this year, but it's almost a shame that this didn't win Best Sound, because this has really good sound design. And then we'll be wrapping up with Zodiac from 2007, the nearly 3-hour-long movie that feels like it's an hour long. Directed by David Fincher, and it stars Jake Gyllenhaal, Mark Ruffalo, and Robert Downey Jr., all characters in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And of course, this is based on the 1986 book detailing the manhunt for the real Zodiac killer, who we're pretty sure we know who he is, but we'll never know for certain. And those are the 3 movies we'll be talking about today. Jason, do you want to take it away with The Night of the Hunter?
The Night of the Hunter from 1955. After a small-town man's bank job goes wrong, he hides the money away with his kids before being dragged off to jail and the hangman's noose. Before he left, he swears his son and daughter to absolute secrecy about the money. In jail, a widow killer posing as a preacher man catches wind of this windfall and sets out to get his tattooed hands on it. He soon enters the life of the children and their widowed mother, doing everything he can to take control of the family and their money, while the kids go to all lengths to stop him.
All right, Jonathan, I had seen The Night of the Hunter before. I don't believe you had, correct?
No, it's been on my list for a while. But yeah, it was very German expressionist, which I was so excited about. Like, every shot in the film is just meticulously lit and set designed. It's gorgeous.
They use a lot of silhouettes and a lot of proscenium staging. Like, there's one or 2 points in the movie, like when he definitely murders the widow in the middle point of the movie. not really spoilers. First half of the movie doesn't count, and you see it coming anyway. Where it just switches to full proscenium style, which is amazing. Like the entire set is encapsulated by black around it. It's super cool looking, and what it evokes is this feeling of watching a fairy tale. Because that's essentially what you're watching.
That's exactly my thoughts.
There's a gender role reversal because normally it's the evil stepmother. Now it's the evil stepfather.
Yeah.
Who's here. He's looking for the gold. He kills the good mother and then chases the kids through the woods. And then eventually they're saved by a kindly stranger.
Yeah, I think of him more as the big bad wolf than as the evil stepmother.
No, 100%. Evil, big bad wolf. He's saying, come out, come out. Yep. What did you think of Robert Mitchum's performance? He is obviously an amazing actor. He came out of the Mercury Theater tradition along with Orson Welles.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
He's known for doing a lot of heavy work. The heavy being old Hollywood slang for being the bad guy, but normally in a lot of noir films or a lot of crime films, but not necessarily in this kind of almost fantasy setting.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that like there's nothing in the film that specifically points it out as fantasy except for just the heightened, exaggerated aesthetic. You know, there's no like magical elements in this. There's just like the embodiment of pure evil chasing after two children who are often, you know, the embodiment of innocence and good. And I mean, the Hansel and Gretel illustrations are just right there, but it plays into a lot of these themes, even just again in the lighting and the setting of the I don't even know what it was technically, like a swamp or a bayou or something,
kind of,
or just
it's like a fantasy version of like the shallow South.
It's
like it's like a Huck Finn setting.
Yeah, and as they're traveling down the river in their little boat, and you're just seeing just shot after shot of predators, just natural predators like a hawk chasing a rabbit or a frog eating a fly. You know, all these things are just intercut with the children running away from Robert Mitchum, and I'm gonna forget all the character names, of course.
I'm not going to remember any. I don't know any character names from this, even though they say that boy's name a lot.
Yeah.
I will say, I think there is kind of one magical moment, Jonathan, where he gets hit in the head with like 10 mason jars and somehow isn't unconscious.
Yeah.
But that's not really that magical of a moment. It was just the moment in the scene where the tension snapped. I will say this character is scarier to me than most modern horror movie villains, like most monsters. Like he's scarier to me than like Jason or Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street. And you know what it is? It's the charm. It's how real he could be. Like this isn't a fantasy setting, but you know that's like the people who do the most damage. The people who can lie with snake oil on their tongue and convince everyone that they're here to do good, when in reality they're doing the most bad. So there's a certain reality
the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And there's so many like wolf and sheep metaphors in this movie. Very direct that he just says in his lines. And his character is essentially a false holy man of sorts. So he's coming in preaching the gospel, but it's very much a lie. I don't think I've ever met a pastor with knuckle tattoos. I don't know. Maybe you have, Jonathan.
I can't say that I have. But I was getting some like Flannery O'Connor vibes at the very beginning, because Flannery O'Connor will often kind of play up Southern religious hypocrisy and that kind of thing, and like just take it to an extreme. So her story Wise Blood, which I've read, and I know you watched the John Huston film.
Wise Blood's it's a good movie. It's a weird movie, but it's good.
Yeah,
but it's actually not too different from this.
It started off with that really weird, like over the top, his over the top religiosity that's so twisted, because he's so against promiscuity, but he just, clearly has excused murder completely out of his mind. And he says that in some of his soliloquies at the very beginning. But yeah, this is a theme. It's not really the most prominent because a lot of the movie is driven by the chase. But that false religiosity does get a foil in Lillian Gish's character, which to bring her in maybe a little early because she doesn't come in until pretty late in the film. But there's this contrast that I want to bring up that I really love, where he's constantly throughout the film singing an old hymn that goes leaning, leaning, leaning on the arms of Jesus, but he never actually gets to the word Jesus in the song. And he's constantly going leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. And he'll stop there and just kind of repeat that part all the time. And then when we see Lillian Gish's character, he's singing that outside of her door as he's kind of stalking them and just waiting for them to come out. And she counters him and she sings leaning on the arms of Jesus back and forth with him as he sings the other parts of the verses. And I thought that was such a nice tete-a-tete that's just very thematic and didn't have to have a lot of action and stuff, but it was so subtle and so beautiful.
And I think what his humming there gets at, or it starts to get at, why we find serial killers so interesting and why they make such good villains and characters in movies, is because there's so many parts about the psychology there that make sense until you get to a certain point and it just breaks.
Because it has to be rationalized to some extent in order for it to happen.
And there's logic there that appeals to our brain, but at the same time, it's out of the ordinary. So, and we've talked about in other films before, Jonathan, how incomplete melodies can add to a feeling of unease and unsettlement in an audience. So
yes.
If you're not familiar with that song, you can tell that there's something missing to it.
Yeah.
Like the melody doesn't resolve itself. The tension in the song doesn't resolve. So you have part of the song, but not the complete bit. So it sounds like it should make sense, but it doesn't. And that's the same thing we see with this character. We see him driven to do stuff, and we see him excusing his own behavior. In fact, that's the first thing we see in the entire movie, is him driving in a car explaining his behavior away. And it makes sense up to a point, and then you still get to the break where you're like, but you shouldn't go around killing people. That's awful and terrible and horrible. And so you're just stuck watching this a loop, and then it gets stuck in your head in the same way that like an incomplete song does. I don't know if you've read the study, Jonathan, that talks about earworms, how we get music stuck in our heads. And the number one way to get rid of an earworm that you're annoyed with is to go listen to the song in completion, because your brain just doesn't have the bit to finish it.
Yeah.
And it's stuck on a loop. And so
that makes sense.
We're kind of stuck in a loop on these characters, which make them so appealing when they do not necessarily have to be realistic. Yeah. Because there's something fundamentally off about the psychology of somebody who's a serial killer.
That, I mean, without being one, it may be impossible to fill in that gap. Not advocating becoming a serial killer. But the last thing I do want to say about the song is that just from a kind of cinematically historical perspective, it reminded me of M and In the Halls of the Goblin King, that Peter Lorre whistles and gives him away as being the child murderer in that film. So there's even kind of a precedent for this tune that almost becomes this telltale giveaway that the killer is near. So it's kind of already become this resonant theme within cinematic rhetoric, as we like to talk about, that songs can kind of be this heads up that, hey, danger is coming.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of unconscious training that you do on an audience throughout a movie that they never realize is happening unless you sit down and realize it. Musical themes, visual themes are all a clue to what works. So what do you think about the more expressionist parts of the film, like the tattoos? that are a little out
yeah.
of the German expressionist camp, but are definitely very theatrical and very keyed into the art of cinema, where we can actually get close enough to see his knuckles on his tattoos. Because as theatrical as that is, it's fundamentally something you can't do in theater unless you're in a very small setting.
Right. Or you put in some kind of ham-fisted exposition,
like magnification or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that it was such an interesting touch. So just to clarify, he has these tattoos on his knuckles. On one hand, he has love, a letter for each knuckle, and on the other hand, he has hate. And so he'll describe how the right hand and the left hand are in this battle, and the right hand, the hate hand almost wins, but the love hand wins in the end. But after he kind of like uses that, we'll often at very specific points in the film see one or the other hand revealed. So when he's courting the widow, we see his love tattoo as he's got his, arms rested on a post or whatever. And then when he's grieving that his quote unquote wife, quote unquote ran away because he murdered her, and he's talking to her parents and saying, she ran away. She was doing all these terrible things. I tried to stop her or whatever, but he's got the hate tattoo on his hand showing. So they give him away too to the audience, in a little more of an obvious way, but in the tone of the film itself, it works. It doesn't feel like too much, I feel like, in the movie.
The whole movie sets up its very dramatic tone where you're going to see crazy stuff and be asked to somehow roll with it. In the first scene where the guy just starts openly talking about killing widows. It's a nice bit. It's a nice bit of audience dissonance, where we see a difference between how the characters feel and the world seems to be feeling about what's going on screen, and how we feel. Because I feel like a lot of the time you just go along with whatever's being presented in movies, and you're like, okay, the characters feel this way, so I should feel this way. And that's pretty standard. That's what you see a lot of the time. But dissonance can be very effective as well, especially when you're creating the sense that the audience is in on this guy's bad. We know this guy's bad, but we're going to see a lot of characters think he's good.
Yeah, and that was like the complete devotion that the other characters had towards him was infuriating in a way that I think was very intentional, because it's not something that we're trying to hide from the audience. Like, we're not sneaking up like, oh my gosh, he was the killer the whole time. No, like you said, we know this from almost the very first shot of the film. And so watching everyone else fall for him just like makes us so upset and frustrated, and more scared for the kids, because they know something that everyone else around them doesn't. And again, it heightens their sense of innocence, because they're being wrongfully accused and they have no grounds to have their case heard, because like he says, it's their word against his, and he's already won all their hearts because that's what he's a master at. And so he's going to win that battle.
I like that in his brainwashing that he does of everybody, he even starts to convince the sister that her brother is evil. Like, it shows like just how much power he has.
But the sister stays loyal, which
she does,
which was nice, even though she does definitely have a draw towards him.
Yeah. I mean, and that just goes to show how much power he has in that situation too. That's the value of a high charisma score, D&D players. It's what makes you a serial killer. Talking to you, bards.
So I do want to get into a little bit more of Lillian Gish's role as the, I don't know if she's like a foster mom or like an orphanage or something like that. But basically she takes in kids who have no parents or nowhere to go. And so they stumble upon her providentially, if you will. And she picks up on all the things that he has been trying to hide. Like she realizes that he's a bad dude, and she's on the side of the kids. But I think the really interesting part about her section is the girl who is already in her home, and we learn that she has been promiscuous, and the amount of non-judgment from Lillian Gish's character and acceptance, and like, you know, once she admits that she's been going out with boys when she was supposed to be going studying or whatever, and she even tried to hit on Mitchum's character, Harry Powell.
God, that part was so creepy.
It was really creepy, but it has so many levels to it, because we know that promiscuity is the one thing that will set him off, and we know that his charm is the one thing that he uses as a weapon. So she falls for both of those things immediately, which put her in a ton of danger, but also leads him straight back to the other kids. But then when she admits to Lillian Gish what she's been doing, Lillian Gish, you know, kind of admonishes her, says, okay, don't do that. I want to be here to help you. I want you to be able to come to me. But she doesn't, you know, murder her or anything like that, because that is the one thing that Harry Powell has been doing for the whole movie. And so it's, again, creating this foil between this acceptance and charity and grace, and just like hardline, legalistic, literal murder on some kind of distorted, moralistic sense.
Yeah, no, they set up as essentially a good pair of like character foils between the two, which is nice. And even her character, while way more moral, is still just as belongs in the same world, in the sense that they both kind of have that exaggeration to them, except one is good and one is bad.
Yeah, and she's got her edge to her. Like, the first thing she does is pull out her shotgun whenever she realizes that he's not going away. So they're a great contrast, and I think, again, just the thematic contrast being as stark as it is accentuates the visual contrast of being so contrasty in the lighting and the aesthetic and all of that. Like, the whole thing just comes together in this really beautiful form of storytelling, even though the material itself is, you know, on its face very, very dark.
Yeah, no, it's a nice little, the whole thing is kind of wrapped up in that contrast between what you expect a fairy tale to be and what fairy tales actually are.
Yeah.
Which is all dark. They all involve stuff like this.
Yeah.
In fact, probably more gruesome. They'd probably get like eaten by a bear or thrown into a bush and lose their eyes on thorns, or cooked in an oven. I can't remember, Jonathan. At the end of this movie, do we actually see him die? Because if not, then it is heavily implied that he is lynched.
Okay. Oh my gosh. We actually have to talk about this, and I'm going to put down the spoiler warning because I almost forgot about the very end, which does turn into a lynch mob, which I was so not expecting, because it was this weird, like, random commentary on, like, mob mentality where, first of all, we have to set up the fact that, again, spoiler warning, I think you can find this movie online. It's from the 50s. Just look it up.
Yeah, but you can get access to this. This is not a hard movie to find. So Harry Powell gets arrested, and in that moment, the boy has this weird flip switch in his head. Switch flip in his head, where he equates Harry Powell, who's been chasing him, trying to kill him, is getting arrested, and he equates him with his father, who got arrested right before his eyes, just before, he's the one that ended up getting Harry Powell on his tracks and gave him all this money and stuff like that. So he goes and he, like, throws the money back at him. He says, don't arrest him, because all of a sudden he has pity for him, which I thought was really interesting in itself. But that leads to the boy not being able to testify in court about Harry Powell. And then the mob was mad at the kids because they wouldn't testify. And so then I think they still convicted him, and then they lynched him, but everyone was just like, it was just madness. I could barely tell what was going on, but it was so fascinating because so much of the movie is just like this slow, prowling hunt. And then all of a sudden it turned into a frenzy. Yeah, because I mean, honestly, you can make this. You can make the point that there's a second storyline in this film. There's two bad guys. There's obviously Harry Powell, who is evil.
Yeah.
No asterisk marks on that at all. But then also there's this going along with whatever sounds nice to your ears or whatever sounds true to your ears that we see over the course of the movie, where for the first like half of the movie, Hal gets away with so much nonsense just because everyone believes him.
He gets away with murder.
Yeah, literally. And then, once we reach the very end of the film, the people aren't being any smarter than they were before. It's just now they're being told something else.
They have a different
target. And we
target.
know it to be true as the audience, but they're just going along with what they've heard. And you're seeing there at the end the chaos that inspires and the danger that inspires. Which is no judgment on the morality of Harry Powell's crimes or what his punishment should be. It's just to point out that there is something else that gets lampooned over the course of this movie.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that the mob turns on the boy who has kind of had this moment where he does have pity for Harry Powell. Even all the bad things that Harry Powell did, he has some level of pity and compassion, but the mob doesn't understand that because they've already switched to the other side. And so they can't stop to think about it. They just got to follow, what is happening right at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much that goes into this movie. It was easy to watch aesthetically, and it was still really thematically and intellectually relevant and deep.
All right, Jonathan, do you want to move on to The Silence of the Lambs from 1991?
Let's do it.
All right, Jason, take it away.
The Silence of the Lambs from 1991. The serial killer known as Buffalo Bill has been kidnapping young women and stripping their skin for a flesh suit. And when he kidnaps the senator's daughter, the FBI tries a new tactic, sending in a cadet, Clarice Starling, to speak with captured serial killer and cannibal Hannibal Lecter, who might be the only one who knows Buffalo Bill's identity. Lecter doesn't work for free, though, and in exchange for his help, drags up Starling's painful childhood memories. So Starling must race against the clock to navigate Lecter's sinister mind games to rescue the victim in time.
All right, Jonathan, so I've seen this movie a bunch of times. You've seen this movie a bunch of times. So let's just jump right into it. And there's a lot here. It's one of these movies that is...
I didn't even realize till I was looking for it.
It's heavy, but it's oddly rewatchable. I found that with this and Zodiac, that even though they kind of have long-ish running times...
Zodiac is almost half an hour, 40 minutes longer than Silence of the Lambs. But
yeah. And I think this movie... Well, Zodiac honestly focuses on this more, but this movie also shows the appeal of serial killers in that kind of obsessive way that
this one gets in their head more than any of the other ones, and it's literally the point of the movie.
Yeah, and I feel like we have the A plot going on, obviously, where Buffalo Bill needs to be found and Clarice needs to talk to Hannibal in order to uncover the secrets to get there. But the really interesting bit is the quid pro quo that exists between the two. He will help her, but he kind of, and I find this interesting because he is a cannibal. He essentially needs to eat her psyche in order to fess up what she needs to do it. And to do that, she dives into this really deep, vulnerable place in her past. In order to dig up all this psychological trauma, which is really excellent to watch because at the start of the movie we see her being not just a hardened person, but a really hardened person. Obviously, there's something going on in her past. We see that flashback with her dad, but we also see that she's the only woman in this completely masculine space, and she never.
Those shots are genius.
Yeah, she never explicitly talks about it, but it's so the direction of putting it into the movie, and you see her getting into the elevator with all these 6.5 foot tall dudes.
They're all a head taller than her.
Or when they go into the room in the dead
police
body
officers,
is found, all the police officers are taller than her, and there's all these huge white dudes looking at her, and you're starting to get so there's this negative trope out there of the strong female character, because that's typically a way to make a character two-dimensional, and not flesh them out anything other than they're female and they are strong. But
they usually call attention to that point as well.
Yeah. But I like Claire Starling because she's strong, but she's also very human. She's rounded out and fleshed, and we see why she's putting on this strong front throughout the entire movie. We understand, but definitely by the end, we understand the source of that hardness, how it started, how it got the ball rolling. And it's not her being hardened that saves the day in the end. It's her being willing to be vulnerable, whether it's opening up to Hannibal Lecter or being willing to go into the suspected serial killer's house alone.
Yeah, I was picking up on a lot of those things that you've been talking about, and in like almost to the degree that this film can, if not exactly, really closely become a Faustian tale, where she's literally giving up her past, because he gives her in that quid pro quo. He says, "What you want is promotion, and I can get you that. You just have to give me your background." And so she's literally making a deal with the devil at this point.
Yeah, and it's not like the background does nothing for him either. He gets free because of it.
Yes, and this is there's also a really nice nuance to this, in the fact that the more of her background that she gives up, the more he does help her progress, but he almost helps her just become a better detective. So in the cage scene, the big cage scene in the room, I don't even know what to call it.
It's like in the hotel,
yeah, but he's like
that part is incredibly expressionistic and theatrical, but we're so deep down the serial killer well at that point that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but he's helping her see. He's helping her pick up on clues, on all these little tiny clues about, what Buffalo Bill has already given away and what she can pick up from what she. So he's not even just like handing her a promotion in a typical sense. He's literally helping her to become a better detective, which is ultimately what gets her, to become promoted and stuff like that, because that's how everyone gets promoted, right? But he becomes her teacher in that moment, and yet, at some point, who are you letting instruct you, and how deep do you let that go? Because at some point, like we were talking about before, there's a disconnect. There's something missing from Hannibal that's mysterious, that we're never going to totally see to the end of, and so it's a dangerous road to start down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very much is her getting sorcery powers, isn't it? Yeah, I also just love how well directed this movie is. Like, it's easy to... I shouldn't say it's easy. I should say there's very many movies out there that fall on the list of all-time classics that are very well directed, but where the directing might not necessarily be one of the forefronting parts that make it one of the best movies ever. In this movie, it definitely is. Even because... especially from the perspective
probably more so than the plot, because it could easily become schlocky with the wrong direction.
Oh, easily. But the amount of setup and payoff, I'm going to talk about two things: setup and payoff, and then the use of the camera, which and the way the camera's used here isn't specifically cinematography. Of course, anything shot through the camera is cinematography, but the choices on what to shoot, that was the director. So we're going to talk about that too. But the first thing, setup and payoff. I'm going to give you an example, Jonathan. In the end of the movie, quick spoiler alert, end of the movie, Clarice Starling is wandering around in the dark, unable to see a Buffalo Bill.
Oh, gosh.
Right? Which is a great scene, utterly terrifying, very well done.
Yeah.
But in the montage, after her first meeting with Hannibal Lecter, where she's going through more FBI training and she's getting distracted. There's one point where she bursts into a room and she goes to get her handcuffs out, and the guy running jumps out from behind her, is like, gun to your head, is like, "Starling, you gotta check your blind spot."
Yeah.
Boom. Just little setups and payoffs. And those are things that you don't notice until after the film if you rewatch it or pay attention or look it up online. But they make the plot flow well. It makes the world feel real. It makes stuff not feel like Deus Ex Machina when it comes when it comes up later. Even though the butterfly is such a small part of the movie, there's enough beats about it. Or I guess it's moth. There's enough beats about it over the course of the movie so that it doesn't feel weird when we get to the part at the end. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is the use of the camera. And this is important in this movie because we're literally doing a lot of psychological work. So when it comes to Clarice, a lot of the times when we're looking at her in camera, she's in the center of the frame. We're looking fairly directly at her, which puts us as the audience in her shoes, which is important because she's our viewpoint character. But then the cinematography alters slightly when we get to her interactions with Lecter. We get closer and closer and closer over the course of the scene to his face. And it's almost like when we look back at Clarice Starling as we're trying to get closer to Lecter with the camera, we're looking into her head because that's what he's doing. He's getting into her head, into her psyche, essentially cannibalizing her trauma for his own uses and pleasure in his own psycho whack job stuff.
Yeah. To that point, there's a moment in his cell with the bars in the big room where the shot and reverse shot show both of their faces covered by bars. So it's almost like they're both constrained, and the camera pushes through the bars throughout the conversation on both of them. It's pretty much mirrored, and it gets closer and closer on both of their faces. And so and that's as she's doing her lamb monologue. And so the more that she releases, the freer she gets because those bars are kind of leaving the frame. And to kind of bring in one of the things we were talking about last episode about the rules and the visual cues and stuff, red is such a big deal in this movie. Every time you see red, there is danger. I mean, red always signifies danger, but very much so in this movie. So even that shot that you mentioned, the first one that shows us that this movie is about Clarice in a male-dominated world, is when she gets into that elevator. 6 other guys in the elevator, all a foot taller than her, all of them in red sweaters. She's in a gray sweater. So she stands out so much against their red, that deep red. And then when she goes in to see Hannibal for the first time, there's a red light that comes on, red bars right before she walks through. And then when we get to Hannibal, he's in like a gray blue. He's in like a very calming color. And actually, this is also really interesting. As the movie progresses, he kind of sheds this gray blue color into just white. In the big Bard jail scene, he's got just his white t-shirt on, which is great when it gets blood on it. Spoiler alert. And then at the very, very, very end of the movie, last shot, he's in a full white suit. And so that's also almost a metamorphosis of Hannibal Lecter too, which is part of, unintentionally on her part, but it's part of Clarice's deal with him, is essentially his release as his end of the Faustian bargain. So there's, again, so much, and not even getting into some of the Buffalo Bill stuff and the freaking lambs and that freaking poodle, which looks like a lamb.
Poor Buffalo Bill. He gets overshadowed in his own serial killer movie.
And did you realize that Buffalo Bill is based on the same serial killer that Norman Bates is based on?
I did not, but that makes sense.
Also Leatherface, apparently, from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So,
All right, Jonathan, what did you think of Hannibal Lecter? Because here's the thing. He is one of the most outright evil villains I've ever seen in a movie, but he's also at the same time so damn likable, which makes him scary. Yeah. Right? Because he's so charming.
Yeah. Again. And Anthony Hopkins' performance has been praised to the moon and back already, but it really is what sells it because he's so intelligent. And that's what makes him so dangerous, is that he's on their same side. He's a psychologist. He's been through the same training. He's played the same games. So they can't use any of their normal tricks on him. And the way that Anthony Hopkins is able to just have that steely composure in every situation, it's he is the original, like, one step ahead villain, where, you know, he may not have the entire plan figured out, but he already knows the next step before any of the actual police officers do. And he knows he's going to get there eventually. And so from his first interaction with Clarice, he already has a direction in mind. And you can tell, like, in every interaction, he knows that he's going farther and farther. And he even uses the fact that she's being played by her other teammates to his own advantage. So he's kind of doing the same thing by bringing up the fact that her police chief is using her to get to him. So she already feels used. And yet it's just this cycle that never ends throughout the film of manipulation on every side, with Clarice just like stuck in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Which the style of manipulation in this movie leads to inherently a lot of twists. They don't really feel like twists, honestly. They don't feel like surprises so much as like, oh, well, that's what they did.
You expect something unexpected, basically, the whole time.
Yeah, but they all make sense. They all have that good sense of a twist about them where they're both surprising, but also when it happens, they make sense too, which is a hard line to walk, as we've talked about before. But even just the scene where he escapes the hotel cage, where he cuts off some dude's face and puts it on his own face. I have seen that. I've seen this movie many times, and every time I get to that scene and I forget what happens, just because the plan is so detailed and so unexpected.
Yeah, they do things to throw you off too, because the one cop says, you know, what do I say to him? He's dying, and the other cop says, he's Jim, what's his face? Dang it, just talk to him, because you know. You have this realization like, oh yeah, man, when people die, like these are their coworkers, like they know them, and yet you still don't know what to say to someone when they're dying. And so you're so like kind of caught off guard in this almost sympathetic moment. And then like a scene later, you realize, oh, it wasn't that guy at all.
Mm-hmm. He just had face on him.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many things in this movie that I feel like have been done a ton afterwards. So sometimes I remember the first time I watched this later, like in college or something. And I remember it feeling very tropey, but it's one of those movies that you feel like is very tropey until you realize like, oh no, it actually like started a lot of these tropes, as far as some of these plot twists and the fake outs and the type of villain that he is. Okay. So Alex, can we talk about the most blatant in your face piece of directorial / editorial trickery in this movie, which is the sting on Buffalo Bill?
Yeah. You know what? It's a little more in your face than a lot of the movie has been up to this point. But I also don't hate it, if for no other reason than the directors earned so much credit by this point in the movie that it's fine. Also, it kind of, it's a good way to resolve the idea that Clarice is on her own from this point. So yes, it's a trick. Yes, it's a tension builder and release, but it also means that, well, it's a very definitive way of showing how alone she's going to be in this final confrontation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just, it's again one of those things that's kind of tropey now, and I was just like, oh man, are they really just gonna go all the way with this? And I'm sure first time watching it, you're like, what? But when you kind of know, it's like, oh, okay, come on, guys. But yeah, I mean, it pays off, and of course, the scene that it leads up to is an incredible climax. But yeah, there are a lot of like twists and turns and just various beats in the movie that lead up to that, and it's all thematically tied together. Again, that's kind of what makes this all have to work, is that you can't just watch a serial killer movie for the serial killer, because that's kind of sick. So adding in those extra elements of the themes and stuff is what makes it not a schlocky slasher horror film. And this is something I want to get to when we get to overall notes, is the fact that all of these films fall into different categories, and I wouldn't call any of them strictly horror.
No, I wouldn't call them horror. You could call them thrillers. I'd buy that.
So just to throw it out there, I would consider Night of the Hunter is, like we were saying, fantasy. You could maybe put it in like southern gothic or gothic horror. So it's kind of on those horror lines. Silence of the Lambs is much more psychological thriller than it is horror. And then when we get to Zodiac, that's just kind of straight mystery. It's almost not even a thriller at some point. I guess, yeah, let's just go ahead and move on to Zodiac.
All right. On to Zodiac from 2007. Take it away, Jason.
Zodiac from 2007. The Zodiac Killer was one of the most terrifying sensations in 1960s California, killing 5 people at random over the course of 1 year. His odd, unaccountable actions and cryptic messages to police and journalists made him both difficult to detect and hard to ignore. Our story centers on Robert Graysmith, political cartoonist, and budding American obsessed with serial killers, Paul Avery, the San Francisco Chronicle's crime reporter. Detective Dave Toschi is also involved, a successful inspector challenged by the case. For months and then years, the three wind their way through the twisted mystery of the Zodiac Killer, following dubious leads and clues. Then, the killer strikes again and again until he suddenly stops, and the case runs cold.
All right, Jonathan, are you ready to see a movie where Iron Man, the Hulk, and Mysterio solve mysteries?
Yeah, this is oh man, so much Marvel going on in this movie. And it's the other part about it is that Robert Downey Jr. just plays Iron Man, or maybe he just plays Robert Downey Jr. I'm not sure.
The funny thing is, Zodiac is right around the time that the first Iron Man movie comes out.
So this the rise of Robert Downey.
Yeah, this is the redemption.
That's true.
Of Robert Downey Jr. As people sometimes forget that he kind of went off the deep end there. He was a Hollywood kid. It's not good, but I also kind of understand. But yes, I quite enjoy this movie, Jonathan. And again, it's 3 hours long, or almost 3 hours long.
Almost,
I should say. Which for me is typically a groan whenever I see a movie that long. But this one just flies by. Just goes down super fast.
I totally feel that way, but not in a bad way. And
you definitely feel the time pass at a certain point in the movie. But I bring the time up just because when I was looking up, obviously we talk about what awards movies have won. Somebody will have noticed that Zodiac didn't win any Oscars and wasn't nominated for any either. Do you know why that is, Jonathan?
Because it's too long and slow?
No. Actually, the movie was set to release in, I believe, early December or late November of 2006. But Fincher was in an argument with the studio about how long the movie was going to be. They made him cut some things. He conceded on a few parts. For instance, there was originally going to be like a 2-minute long black screen section where you hear like where time passes, like a lot of years pass and 1 or 4 years pass, and you're supposed to hear the change of music styles that, with your categorical knowledge of all music, is supposed to tell you what year it is. But that was cut. There were some other things that cut, but he wouldn't budge on some things, and they really wanted him to get it down below 2 hours. Or at 2 hours, because they thought that would be best for Oscar contention, but he wouldn't budge, and he had final cut. So eventually it came out in March of 2007. Now that's a problem because of how the Oscars work. And we've talked about Oscar bait a million times, Jonathan, but one of the things that we've mentioned is that Oscar bait movies that want to be in contention, typically come out in the fall, typically the late fall, to be as close to the Academy Awards as possible. And that's because the Oscars are kind of dumb and they have a very short memory. And if it comes out in March, everyone's going to have forgotten about it by the time the Oscars are being voted on.
Because the Oscars ceremony is in February. So movies that come out right after the ceremony are going to be forgotten by the next ceremony.
Yep. So hence the problem. Hence one of the big reasons why Zodiac wasn't even nominated for any awards that year. It's not that anybody even had a real problem with the movie. It was just came out at a bad time. Yeah. And I
It's not
marked
like
this as my
Fincher's a
reason.
nobody director.
Yeah, I marked this as my reason number 642 why the Oscars are dumb. Just
I
because
need
that's
a full listicle posted on the Filmlings
oh, you
blog.
want the BuzzFeed article?
Yeah, exactly.
I could maybe
700
do
reasons
42
why.
reasons. I mean, I could just list individual movies that won Oscars to get to 700. That would not be difficult.
That could work.
There's so many Oscars that are won out there and just make no sense.
Yeah. But
Anyway,
we've been
all
down
that to
road.
say, Zodiac got done dirty because of how the calendar and people's memories work. Okay,
But let's
Jonathan,
talk
what
about
do you?
why it ended up being so long.
Yeah, why was it
Or
so
why
long,
it's
Jonathan?
important that it is so long. Because one of the I remember I watched this a while ago, and I remember just kind of like, not being totally blown away the first time that I watched it. And it still like kind of has this tension with me, but I think I kind of understand why, because Zodiac is going for it's kind of making a point, and I think the point that it's making is it's being an anti-Dirty Harry, almost explicitly, in the sense where Dirty Harry and a lot of action cop movies do this thing where the cops burst in at the end and they shoot the bad guy dead, almost in the same way that Silence of the Lambs ends. But Zodiac is going for a different purpose in order to give a better sense of real detective work and like the real stress and struggle that comes with due process. Because there's a line in there where Mark Ruffalo is like, Jake Gyllenhaal tells him that they burst in and they kill the bad guy, and Mark Ruffalo says, "Well, so much for due process." And that's kind of what this movie is. This movie is the due process. It's going through, checking all the boxes. If there's a box that doesn't match up, if there's anything, any little thing that could give reasonable doubt, you can't pin it. And so it continues, and the mystery just draws on. And I think that at some point in the movie, you realize it's still going, and all the characters realize it's still going, and it may never fully end. And it hasn't ended. And that's also the point. But you have to kind of get to this point where you're like, we've been over this, we've done this, we've been to this place, we've talked to these people. And that feeling, that fatigue that comes with the movie inherently, which typically is a bad thing for movies, is also sort of the point of this movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, one of the interesting things I find about this movie, Jonathan, is how it represents Dave Toschi, who's Mark Ruffalo's character. Because it addresses it specifically at a screening for Dirty Harry in this movie.
Right.
But Dave Toschi is the inspiration for both a lot of Dirty Harry's character and a lot of Steve McQueen movies, including Bullet.
Okay.
Which is crazy because we see Dave Toschi as this guy who's actually, he's a solid detective. He follows the rules, and he's a nerd. He wears like a bow tie.
He does
in a really
the entire
awkward
movie.
In a really awkward way, and I'm like, "Where's your bow tie, Steve McQueen?"
As opposed to like Robert Downey Jr., who's like just like the Riddler half the movie,
which is crazy, especially because this movie deals with essentially this moment in time in America where both serial killers are mythologized, but also over the course of this movie, we see detectives and cops be mythologized into like these action heroes. When in reality, like Dave Toschi's over there just doing like paperwork for like the 100th time.
or just on the beat or whatever.
Yeah. Nothing nearly as exciting, which is important also because of the length of the movie and the time period that it covers, because it shows that change in America at the end of the 60s into the 70s, this change in perception, this change in obsession, the persistent obsession of certain things like serial killers that's there. Now, what did you think, Jonathan, of the style of this movie? Because the scenes where people get killed, especially early on, there's a certain point where it changes a bit. The lake scene is particularly brutal and much less stylish, but a lot of the ones that happen at night are just are kind of like almost like these edgy music videos, which makes sense because it's Fincher doing it, and that's the world he came from. But what do you think about the use of style in this movie?
I think in those moments, I was thinking less about the style and more about the abruptness, because I think that is something that differentiates this from a lot of serial killers, and certainly from being in any kind of B slasher horror genre. Because even though it does have like moments, it doesn't have a lead up. It doesn't have, this really long drawn out process. It's literally, oh wow, that car was kind of sketchy, and then the car comes back and the guy gets out and no words are exchanged, just gunfire and slow motion blood and stuff like that. And then we hear about the aftermath and stuff later on. We don't usually see that. And so it was just this very like, the lack of ceremony, I think, especially after watching the other two movies where the serial killers are all about, this put on air and this, this satisfaction that comes from leading up to it. And we get a little bit of that, like in the lake scene with the costume and stuff. But a lot of the ceremony comes from him trying to get to the public, trying to get through the newspapers, trying to get through the cops and stuff like that, rather than trying to get to the victims. The victims are more or less inconsequential.
Yeah. The victims do get lost in the story because everyone's obsessed with...
except insofar as they can shed light on the case.
Yes. It's not necessarily about the human suffering of those who died at the hands of the Zodiac killer or who survived the hands of the Zodiac killer. It's about the public perception of the case. It's very much following like the news cycle of the case, very literally, because two of our main characters are journalists, and watches this case just kind of chews him up and spits him out.
And yet the other thing is we don't get the perspective of the public. All we get is the perspective of the law enforcement and the journalists.
We get a couple radio segments where people are calling in.
Oh, that's right. We get that, and then we get the one bit of the couple who solves the code.
Yeah. Which, quick sidebar, Jonathan, the people calling in about the serial killer, it sounded a lot about people talking about the virus.
It's true. Just like a really kind of flippant. Well, here's my highly educated opinion.
It's not going to happen to me. Or I think he's crazy, or all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
Yep. It's not going to happen to anyone except the people it happens to, right?
Mm-hmm. But that is the way of the Zodiac. I do like the idea of... One, I find this film funny because it came out, I think, before the full rise of true crime podcasts, but people were already kind of obsessed with serial killers.
I was definitely getting those like serial vibes where, if Fincher was a documentary filmmaker, this would have been, serial on video.
Yeah. The other thing I like is it shows the danger of the obsession in a way, and not in that the serial killer turns on you, although there are one or two points where Jake Gyllenhaal's character gets heavy breathing over the phone. Which we're pretty sure we know
with Robert Downey Jr.
who that is. Yep. But just to have that ever-present obsession that's constantly frustrated does something to the human psyche, and we see it. And we even see like the course of Jake Gyllenhaal's failed marriage and then second marriage too, how it affects him over the course of those things. This is quite interesting.
That was my big takeaway from this film, is that the film doesn't focus on, the victims and the killings and stuff like that. Yes, we get the killings and they're gruesome for however long they last. But, there's not a killing after probably the 45-minute mark. Maybe it can't be farther than like halfway through the film that we actually see a murder. And so the rest of the time, I feel like what the film is about is the fallout of the obsession of the serial killer. It's watching Robert Downey Jr.'s life go down the drain, even as he kind of rises to stardom, writing about the case. It's watching Mark Ruffalo's partner just gets so burnt out that he has to move districts. It's watching Jake Gyllenhaal's marriage fall apart because he gets so into this cold case that's not going anywhere and trying to write this book that he just ignores his family. And watching Mark Ruffalo's character just give up on the case. He's the one who has the closest ties to it. And, you know, he's stopped. I mean, because at some point, as much as like his point makes sense that other people get murdered, like other things are going on. At some point, the evidence is so old, everything is so old that you've got to focus on what is happening right now. And so it's a really hard thing, but it's going through like all of these tough decisions, but along the line, like just everyone involved in the case that we've been following for the first hour 15 of the movie just start to drop off the case, and their life, you know, for the most part just kind of goes down the drains because they've devoted so much time to this one serial killer. And that's kind of just watching the collateral of what this kind of thing does to people.
Yeah, and I mean, the filmmakers themselves got pretty obsessed with it too. Fincher and
I was thinking that.
The writer actually spent 18 months investigating and researching the Zodiac killer.
That doesn't sound healthy.
Definitely. No, it's clearly not. I mean, it made a good movie. But also we see over the course of the movie that the answer is no, it's not healthy. And we also have which means the two huge creative forces on the movie know it's not healthy. And we're probably speaking from experience of, like my wife tells me I need to stop. Yeah. It's been 18 months. I probably need to stop. They definitely present a solid idea of who they think the killer is, and they nudge you very hard in that direction. But they
actually
also
give you
leave
two.
With
one bigger, but the other one they start to get really really forceful about the second subject or suspect later on in the film.
Which one?
The movie guy, the projectionist.
Oh, the guy who Jake Gyllenhaal is gonna thinks is gonna kill him.
That got a little ham-handed too.
That was I like that scene. It felt very tense. I kind of would have liked it a little earlier in the movie, maybe, if I'm going to be nitpicky, but it's still very good. And serves its purpose, if for no other reason than it shows how paranoid Gyllenhaal is going to get. Yeah. So here's the question, Jonathan. Who do you think it was?
I am so unqualified to answer that question.
I still think it's a Lee. I think it's got to be Lee.
Yeah, they don't give hardly any like disqualifying information about Lee. And the handwriting gets so monotonous at some point. We're like, every single thing lines up, but not the handwriting, because the handwriting psychologist said so. Even though he drank himself into a ditch, the handwriting specialist said that it doesn't match, so we can't convict him.
Which also shows the tediousness of law.
Right. It's the due process. That's the whole movie.
They kind of end the movie with a bit of a spinning top, like Inception style. And I feel like titles. I feel like they almost just did that or with specifically the guy who plays Mary Lightly from Psych. Picking out who the killer is, and he points at Lee, and then he's like, he had a face like that guy. And he reconfirms.
And then the titles say, DNA evidence exonerated Lee, even though he died several years later or whatever.
I'm willing to bet Fincher and the writer still think it was Lee, but they
make it very clear just through what information is presented through the film. Because, I mean, they're basically building an argument through cinema, you know, in a way that they could have done in a true crime podcast or something like that. I think that's why I started to feel like it was Serial, because Serial ends up having like such a bias, even though it tries to be objective as possible. And Zodiac kind of does the same thing. Like, it's trying to show this objective like view of the journalism and stuff, but it still has a pretty heavy bias.
It definitely does. But I think that's part of the point of the movie, is that it is inconclusive. And that part of the fun of serial killers is, I know, big question mark. But look, here's the thing. People do use serial killers as fun entertainment. This is the point we're at, Jonathan.
Yeah.
This is the America we live in. People
we into
like
overall
true
notes
crime
now,
podcasts.
Alex?
I guess we are.
All right, we're in overall now.
I'm shouting, so we're we're in overall notes now. So yes, people use it as fun, essentially, which is weird. And this movie, all these movies, show why they're so entertaining. But also, there's like this moral question that you have to ask yourself: of is it right to be enjoying these people who cause so much evil and terror and bad stuff,
and damage to real lives?
I think also part of the psychology of it is knowing that it's slightly wrong to enjoy it makes it more enjoyable for some people, which gives you like this weird like endorphin loop of enjoying the same thing over and over until you're just addicted to true crime podcasts, and that's the rest of your life, and you do nothing else, and you lose your spouse and your job and your home just because you do nothing but sit there and listen to true crime podcasts. Sorry, am I being weirdly obsessive right now?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. But it serves your point. Go. Yeah. No, I mean, we could go even broader and say that, you know, at this point, any information can be turned into entertainment, whether it should or not, because that's the culture that we've built in America. But that's a little bit of a too broad of a discussion for this scope. But yeah, it is this weird thing where like the darkest parts of humanity tend to draw us. If you'll excuse the Silence of the Lambs pun, like moths to a flame. And it's this thing where it's something so incomprehensible that, you know, you almost want to distance yourself as much from the killer as possible. And so you have to get more and more information. Like, where am I different from this person? Like, how am I not going to become this person? You know, and, you know, the more similarities you find, the more differences you want to find. And like, how were they raised? Where were they born? How did they do how did they even get away with this? Like, how does this happen? Because it's so outside of the realm of common experience that it seems like a never ending kind of well of mystery. Because there is that piece of it that can never really completely be understood. And that is also a good thing, that a majority of people will never understand what it is to be a serial killer. And so that's the thing, is where most people will never know what it's like to be a serial killer, thankfully. But because of that, it makes those anomalies more interesting because they're ununderstandable.
Yeah, it's humanity adjacent, but it's still a perversion of the psyche and what we understand to be human or understand to be moral, that it becomes inherently fascinating. And yeah, it's so hard to completely ignore it because it's so fun or so interesting to get into and examine and obsess over. And our minds like mystery. They like stuff being locked behind doors that's hard to get to, and we struggle to get to it. And that can be a satisfying thing if you get to the other side. And because of the nature of a lot of these cases, especially like something like Zodiac, you never will get to it. So it's a perpetual, endless goose chase that you can get an endorphin rush off of anytime you want to. Reading new theories or supposed evidence or accounts or books that have dropped. It is essentially one of the things serial killers achieve, in a way, one of the many things that people try to do through storytelling all the time: create mystery, create interest, and then create investment, where you want to see them caught. And also, as a slightly newer thing that's become much more in vogue over the past, technically since the 60s in America, but in super duper mainstream culture, like what you see on like your nightly network TV, in the past, 10 or 20 years, moral vaguity, where we like seeing anti-heroes and characters that are odd. Not that serial killers are anti-heroes. They're not.
Yeah. But it's the charming aspect of many of them, like we see in Silence of the Lambs and Night of the Hunter, almost puts them on that line, which, they still fall solidly in the villain category, but the similarities between the charming and dastardly anti-hero and the charming and evil serial killer gets a little gray somewhere in there.
Yeah. It all to say, it's a very successful genre? Style? I don't know. What would you call it, Jonathan? Subgenre?
Yeah. We like subgenres.
Subgenre, a little bit crime, a little bit, I guess a little bit true crime, even the ones that are made up. Definitely thriller thrown in there, and mystery as well. The concept of genre is incredibly fluid, and not something to get hung up on, but it can be a convenient tool to help you understand groups of movies and tropes across them. But yes, anyway, anything else to say about serial killers, Jonathan?
I think that'll about wrap it up.
All right. In that case, what are we talking about next time on the show?
Yeah, so next time we ran a poll recently on our Patreon, which I will mention in a moment. But we're circling back to the world tour that we did all the way back in season 1, where we picked, I think it was more than 10 different countries because the last episode was kind of a hodgepodge.
But it was 3 different countries. So technically it was 12 countries.
12 countries, and we looked at various films and directors just to kind of get a feel for different types of cinema around the world. So I picked 3 like really big name directors that we did on that episode, but we just kind of briefly touched on. And so we're going to do a deep dive on one of them that our patrons chose, and that director is Yasuziro Ozu. And he is a Japanese director who we've talked a lot about Akira Kurosawa on the podcast. Not so much recently, but at the start, we did a ton of Kurosawa stuff. And Ozu is, they share a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences and a lot of in tone. And so we're going to dive into some of that with his films, Late Spring from 1949, Floating Weeds from 1959, and Autumn Afternoon, his last film in 1962. Yeah,
it should be a fascinating trilogy. He's a very different style of director, much more subtle. Essentially, I would argue he's the inventor of slice of life off the top of my head, but we're gonna have to do some research to really prove that. But his
Paul
movies
Schrader
are
calls
very
him
much
transcendental.
Well, if Paul Schrader said it.
He wrote a whole book about it, so there's that.
But he certainly takes a lot of inspiration from haikus, as you can just see, because all 3 of these titles have a nature theme wrapped in them, which many people don't know, but one of the lines of most haikus has to be related to nature, at least it's traditional. So yes, we're going to take an interesting look at the development of his movie making, and also get a very interesting slice of life of post World War II Japan during its occupation and reconstruction during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it should be a fascinating look at those 3 movies. I'm very much looking forward to it. What's new on the bonus podcast, Jonathan, and other sorts of Patreon type things?
Yeah, so we do have a Patreon. If you would like to support the show, you can do that over there. You can join our digital community where we have a Discord for talking about movies and Netflix parties and stuff like that. And we also have a bonus podcast tier. And the last episode that we just did was about Within Our Gates, which was released in 1920 and is probably the oldest film that we still have record of by an African-American director. And we found it surprisingly in a good way, like deep and insightful. It had a lot of meat on its bones.
It was a lot more depth to most movies from that era than you would expect, that typically just deliver plots with some themes to them. This one goes real deep. There's a lot of rich textual stuff to get into, and we talk about it all on the bonus podcast. All right, everybody, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Also Leatherface, apparently, from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So Ed, shout out, I guess, to Ed Gein, who murdered a lot of people and got a lot of movies made about him.
I don't think you get to shout out serial killers, Jonathan.
No, that's probably bad taste. But, oh gosh.
Not with that attitude.
There's another pun. So let's move on.